In this video, what I want to talk about is the puckering effect. Now, the puckering effect is something that often happens 1 or 2 months after you've wrapped something. Looks great when you're done, and then you look at it 1 or 2 months later and you see all these wrinkles that develop, oftentimes around, let's say, molding around windows, breaks between cars, or even when you tighten up screws and bolts. And so what you often think about is those wrinkles occurred because it's the manufacturer's fault. Maybe there's a defect in the material, the adhesive, but it's actually not that. So in this video, what I want to talk about is why the puckering effect occurs, and then on the 3 main hotspots around windows, breaks between sections on a car, and the screws and bolts is how to avoid those, shows tips and tricks. Because once you understand why the puckering effect occurs and you know how to avoid it, it actually helps lower install time and create that long-term quality. Let's get to it. One of the most common areas to get puckering is around the molding on the window. So what most often occurs when you're doing color change wraps. With color change wraps, taking a lot of hardware off. So this molding comes out, and it's actually a tricky molding to come out. The chance of bending is really high. But that being said, the molding comes out, the material's wrapped to the top, and actually the body of the car goes much further behind the molding right now. The molding's put back, and it looks great. Full coverage. You're not cut. There's no chance of cutting the paint right now. It's a really safe way of doing it. But the problem is that puckering effect is going to come back and maybe bite you. So what that means is you're going to get these wrinkles if you wrap all the way underneath the molding. Over time, the material might get pushed out. Why does it get pushed out? So basically, the scenario for this particular area right here is this. All right, is the body of the car comes to here. All right, so this is the shape of the car underneath the molding. So this is the face of the door right here that you're looking at right now. It comes up, goes up, and stops right here. And the molding actually comes right here. So this is the chrome molding that sits on top. Now what you have to think about is once this molding comes off, the installer takes the material and then wraps it all the way to the top here and cuts it off, which is fine. Molding goes back down, looks great. But what you have to think about is just brass tacks, is the gap right here is generally not very wide. So it's maybe 1 to 2 mil wide. So the material that goes in, all right, is generally the wrapping material, whether color change or full print, is generally around 3.3 to 6 mil thick. So what you have to think about logically, that just doesn't make sense. You're putting something that's thicker than the gap itself. So what does that mean over time? It means that when the sun starts to shine on the molding, whether it's chrome or rubber, what it does is when it gets hot, it expands. And when it expands, because the gap is so tight and the material is just kind of sandwiched in there, once it gets tighter and tighter, there's really nowhere for it to go except for out. And that's when you get those wrinkles, okay? That's the puckering effect. So this is a big problem. So if you take the molding out and then you wrap to the top, put the molding back in, that's actually long-term really risky because you're gonna get that puckering effect. And if you get the puckering effect, that means that you might have to redo that door, and that can be really costly for your business and your profit goes bye-bye. So I wanna show 2 ways to avoid the puckering effect around the window right here. So now we get to the first option of how to work around this molding, is what I call a tuck and cut. Now the tuck and cut is you actually don't take the molding out. You leave the molding in, put some masking tape here, and this is basically lowering the surface energy, making it easier to pick the material up and tuck it in. And the idea is that you're gonna take the material, wrap the door, and once you get to this section here, you're going to set the material up, pick it away from the molding, tuck it in, and then you cut it out, okay? So this is definitely, you have to have some good knife skills here, but once you build these knife skills, in a way, it does take a little bit of time to set up the masking tape and then tuck it in, and you have to have a good knife skills. But what I like about it is you don't have the risk of taking the molding out. Once you cut it to here and you get full coverage, you're not tucking underneath the molding, so that means you're not gonna get the puckering effect. There's no pressure to push the film out. So again, this is option number 1 to neutralize the molding. Another option here is what you can do is you can take the molding out. So in this case, if you do feel like you don't have those cutting skills, or you want to make sure that you don't come up short here, you can set up the door, take the molding out. But before you take the molding out, I highly recommend taking a water-soluble pen, little marker right now, and marking where the molding ends. If you mark where the molding ends now, what you can do is come back in with knifeless tape, take the molding out, and put the knifeless tape about 1/4 inch or maybe like 1 centimeter past the marker right now. And then you wrap the door, but instead of wrapping to the top now, you're actually cutting the knifeless tape right about here. So that really avoids a lot of that pressure from the molding right now, and it's a very safe way to do it. So again, with either scenario, you're either gonna cut it short to there where the molding is, or cut it back with a knifeless tape, but you're not wrapping all the way to the top. So with both scenarios, basically you're gonna cut the material short instead of wrapping all the way to the top. One scenario, you can leave the molding on. One scenario, you can take the molding off and then use knifeless tape. But with either one of those scenarios, you're really neutralizing the tension on the material and avoiding the puckering effect. And what I like about that, again, long term, it means that with both scenarios, you don't have to take the molding off again when you do the hardware, when you do the removal of the vinyl. It should slide right out underneath the molding, and then you're safe and good to go. So now this is neutralizing the window molding from the puckering effect. Now let's get to the bumper and the fender. Now we get to the break between the bumper and the fender. Now this scenario of puckering effect will pretty much never come up when you're doing, let's say, a full print wrap, because the full print wrap, you're never going to take the bumper off. You're just going to kind of bridge, cut it, you're good to go because it's a commercial wrap. But for color change, let's say a light gray car and you're trying to make it red, the chance of coming up short here and redoing it is really high. So what a lot of people do is they loosen up the bumper, and then they or take the bumper off, and then they wrap it deep behind the bumper and deep behind the back fender, and then put the bumper and the fender back together. The problem is, and this is very similar to the window scenario, is that you have to imagine the back of the bumper does this, okay, it curves up and then it goes in and cuts off inside the car, and the back fender does the exact same thing, cuts off in here. So behind here it goes back, let's say 2 inches or about 3 or 4 or about 5 or 6 centimeters. And so same scenario as before, you take the wrap material and you come down and you wrap down here, wrap inside, come inside here, here. So this is the bumper, fender, and then you put this sandwich in. This sandwich of the material right now can be between 6.6 and much thicker. So again, but the gap here, very similar to how the window is, the gap naturally between the back fender and that is generally between, let's say, 1 and 3 millimeters. So again, you have a very tight gap and you're putting 2 layers of material in, and that's just a recipe for puckering. So basically what's going to happen is over time, this is not necessarily going to get warm like the molding around the window, but what this is doing is going to get a lot of vibration. So once the car is going and the bumpers and the car is shaking and stuff like that and moving, the parts are moving, what this does is generally kind of creates that friction and then forces the material out. So you're going to get puckering not from heat, but from motion. So what you have to think about is then doing this scenario and wrapping all the way underneath the bumper and all the way underneath the back fender is a recipe for puckering that can lead to very costly redos, because if you have puckering effect on a bumper and you have to redo the bumper, that can be extremely time consuming, and then your profit's going bye-bye. So again, how do you neutralize this? Again, 2 different ways. For me, first and foremost, the easiest is the tuck and cut. So here, if you get really good with your tuck and cut technique, get the material here, and let's say you're wrapping the bumper, is you pick the material up right to here, you tuck the material in nice and clean, and by picking the material up and tucking it in, it avoids overstretching the material and jamming it in. It's nice and relaxed in there, and then you cut on the back fender side, and then you do the exact opposite for when you're wrapping the back fender. You pick it up, tuck it in, then cut on the bumper side, and that should give you just enough material where you get just enough visual so that the gray is covered, but you're not getting that tension when the two are rubbing together, and then it doesn't push out. So that's option number 1. Another option is to take knifeless tape, and instead of doing the tuck and cut, what you can do now is, instead, like when you're wrapping the bumper, what you can do is you can set up knifeless tape right here, and you can put it on the back fender side. So what you're doing by doing this is now you're getting that little bit of material that once you cut it will tuck in between the gap, so you'll get full coverage without having the tension for the long term. So you can see by cutting here, by cutting it and then tucking it in between the two, there's not that too much tension, but you get that full coverage here. So again, tuck and cut or knifeless tape in this gap is super, super safe, and that'll help avoid that long-term puckering, but it also means that you don't have to take the bumper off anymore, which saves a huge amount of time. So it looks like you took the bumper off, but you didn't, and that's a big game changer right there. Now let's get to the final one of getting the puckering effect around bolts and screws and how to avoid that. So now we get to the kind of sneaky puckering effect that often happens, and it actually can happen pretty immediately after you get done wrapping, and that is when you tighten hardware back up over a section that you just wrapped and you get these wrinkles and turns and stuff in the vinyl. So here's a good example of is a couple days ago wrapped this cabinet and had the prepper come in, and then he put the hardware back on, and he was a new prepper. So what he did is tighten everything up nice and tight. So with that, you know, obviously it's good, you want the hardware back in nice, super snug, but because the material is freshly put on, it created the puckering effect around the hardware. So we got the material kind of lifting here on the top. On the sides, you can see it poking out right here. So obviously the hardware here has it coming in really tight, and there's the exact same logic as between the bumper and the fender and also the molding here is the gap right there. Once the hardware got put back on, it came really flush to the main surface that was wrapped, and that hardware coming down and twisting pushes the material back out. So again, you get the puckering effect around hardware, and that often happens between, like, let's say, you know, the same thing happened on this right here. You got the puckering effect here, here, and here. And so what this obviously does is it lowers quality instantly. You don't have to wait for it because this is not pressure coming from heat, you know, the material expanding, or friction when it's going back and forth. It's just coming in too tight and just being tightened up too much. So again, when this happens, obviously you have to fix it right away, because if you don't, obviously the client's not going to be super happy about it. So how do you avoid it? Is basically when you know that this is going to happen, you have two ways to deal with it. You can actually add heat and really get the adhesive flowing, because if this was sitting for, let's say, 1 or 2 days, the adhesive would really set up on the main surface and that chance of getting puckering would go down a lot. But obviously you don't have the luxury to kind of wait 1 or 2 days before putting the hardware back on. So you can add heat to get that adhesive flowing so it really sets up, then put the hardware back on. And or what you can do is when you're tightening the hardware and you know that the screws are going to go right on top of something you wrapped, just don't tighten it as hard as you normally do. So just kind of get it slightly snug and then you're good to go. And if it does happen, you do get the puckering as soon as you tighten up a bolt, obviously unloosen the bolt or screw so the material can relax, add some heat, that'll trigger the memory effect and the puckering effect will go away. Then you kind of tighten the screw back up, but not as tight as before. So again, that's the story for getting the puckering effect around bolts or hardware that you're putting back on. So overall, this is the story for puckering effect. And I hope you really understand how it happens, why it happens, and then good tips on how to avoid it. Because again, what I like about it is once you know about it and how to avoid it, it actually will help lower your install times and increase that long-term quality. Thank you for watching. Justin Pate.